Anyway, I'm delighted that you're here for this discussion on informality in South Asia. And we have, in addition to myself, there'll be three people who will speak. Amit Basole from UMass Boston, and Deepankar Basu from UMass Amherst, and Matt Nohn from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And Tarun, Khanna may join the discussion as well, but the four of us have had a go-round beforehand. We each submitted a note to each other on what we would talk about, and we were supposed to look at, here, these questions are what we had posed as sort of the questions that this workshop would address. What do we know about the informal economy in South Asia, its size and composition? What are the links between the formal and the informal economies? We wanted to have a little bit of a focus on city governments and their response to informality, and what do informal workers themselves need and want? And then a big picture question. Should South Asia pioneer an inclusive approach to informality that encourages economic diversity and combines formal, informal, traditional, modern economies in innovative ways? And the reason for that question is that South Asia is the region of the world, as we'll show in data, that has the highest incidence of informality. And we are really grappling with how to tackle it and deal with it. The plan is that from our notes, we broke down our topics into three clusters, and we'll have a discussion, brief presentations and discussion by each cluster. So the first cluster is the size and heterogeneity of the informal economy. The second is key conceptual and research questions that arise. And the third is key policy challenges. So that is the plan. And I think what we'll do, since we're a big enough group, is that we'll not do a go-round, but when people speak in the discussion part, please do introduce yourself so we can all get to know each other. I know some have gotten to know each other through earlier sessions. So let's start with the first cluster on the size and heterogeneity, and I'm just going to take the prerogative of the chair and just do some brief introduction to the informal economy. First, because we always have to start with definitions in the informal economy debates, is a plea that we don't need to start with definitions. There are definitions, and these are the official international statistical definition of informal employment. And what it shows is that there are two groups in the informal workforce: the self-employed and the wage workers. And the self-employed in what are called informal enterprises, which are unincorporated enterprises that may also be unregistered or small. Unincorporated means they're not a legal entity. Among the self-employed, there are different groups, and I've outlined those there. And then there are wage workers in informal jobs. These are jobs without employer contributions to social protection. And actually, in some contexts, I know in India, that's actually the growing part, and it's informal wage workers for formal firms that is actually growing, perhaps the fastest in India. So that's the definition. Here is recent regional estimates based on recent official data for the different regions of the world, showing what share of non-ag employment is informal. And you'll see that South Asia is the region where the highest incidence of informality among non-agricultural employment. The reason we don't include agricultural employment is because there's no accepted international definition of what is informal in agriculture. We're getting there, but we don't have it yet. If you add agriculture, then of course the share of informality grows. So in India, if it's non-ag employment, 84% is informal. If it's all employment, ag and non-ag, it's closer to 93 or 94%. So that's just a regional comparative perspective why it's so important in South Asia. Just to say, based on those same estimates, this is the breakdown of informal employment by whether it's wage or self-employment. And you can see that it's roughly equally half, just always slightly more self-employed and slightly less wage-employed, except in sub-Saharan Africa. Just one point on differences by sex. You will see in South Asia that a far higher percentage of women than men are self-employed because of constraints on women often going outside the home. So they tend to be more self-employed. And then finally, this is fairly new, the first time in history or herstory that we have a breakdown in any of the South Asian countries. This is of urban employment, total and informal. 4 groups of urban informal workers. These are groups that the network I represent works with. But these 4 groups, domestic workers, home-based workers, street vendors, and waste pickers, represent around 23% of total urban employment in modern India, and of informal employment a slightly higher percent. So we're beginning to get better data on the phenomenon. So I'm going to hand over to Amit, who has a handout. The handout that is a chart called the Informal Economy. It's a wonderful schematic chart to help us think about the heterogeneity.
Okay, thanks, Marty. This looks like a lot, but it was my attempt to think through as much as to tell others about this. So it's me thinking about how to organize this, and it's based, I should say, on Professor Chen's work and many other studies, excellent studies on looking at what we talk about when we talk about the informal economy. And the first thing is that we are not talking about one thing, right? So when we start talking about policies or problems or whatever, we have to keep in mind what aspect or what part of the informal sector is actually being discussed. Street vendors don't have the same problem as home-based women workers, who don't have the same problems as casual workers in formal sector factories, who don't have the same problems as domestic servants in households, and so on. So this schematic is a way to kind of organize that. I'm just going to go through it very briefly, not the whole thing, it's more or less just for your reference. So we can divide it up as the Sen-Gupta Commission on the informal sector did in terms of informal employment and informal enterprises. Right? So when you talk about informal employment, we're talking about people who are employed informally, wage workers who are employed informally in formal sector firms. So Maruti Suzuki hiring casual workers through contractors or something like that would be an example of this kind of employment. That's on the one hand, that's on the extreme left of the handout. And then similarly, informally employed but in households are the domestic servants. Right? So these are very different kinds of workers, obviously. One are workers employed in capitalist factories, and the other are basically just working in households for wages, but they are both wage workers. But they have very different problems, and I've listed below the main characteristics and the problems of each group. So for example, regularization of contracts and the right to organize is a big issue in casual labor in factories. Right? In domestic workers, on the other hand, things like implementing the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers would be an important issue. Right? So that's on the one side, the informal employment part. The informal enterprises is where there's a lot more diversity. Right? And again, here my point is to emphasize that the specific problems are very different when you come to different things. So for example, if you broadly think about self-employment versus subcontracting. So people might put subcontracted enterprises also in self-employment depending on how you define things, but I'm separating out truly own account enterprises that produce and sell for the market, as opposed to enterprises that take orders from larger units. Right? So these two have very different problems. In one case, it's a problem of finding a suitable market, finding a demand, and selling in the open market. In the other case, it's a question of what is your relationship with a larger unit that is putting orders out to you. What kind of prices do you get for your for the work that you do for that larger unit? And to go back to what Professor Chen just said about wage workers within the informal sector are not only in informal employment but also informal enterprises. So a lot of really small informal enterprises also employ wage workers. We are not talking only about like one-person firms or family firms. We're talking about firms that employ maybe 2 people, 3 people, 5 people who are working for wages. And these are highly dispersed. So it's difficult to organize, and all of these things come in here. But, and I don't want to leave this slide without pointing out that the entrepreneurs in the informal sector should also be our focus of attention when we talk about the informal sector. So not just informal sector workers, right? But people who own informal sector firms, either working for themselves or hiring workers, they have certain very specific problems to do with how to coordinate with other firms, how to organize at the entrepreneurial level to lobby the state or national governments for various kinds of infrastructure, facilities, credit, access to credit, all of these things which workers may not themselves face. Right? So the owners face these problems, which I have listed here as entrepreneur own workers and entrepreneur job workers, by which I mean to distinguish between, again, people who run their own firm and sell in the market versus people who run their own firm but largely produce for a larger firm through orders. And they are different, and they have different problems. And finally, going all the way to the right, there's a huge part of the informal sector which is what I've called petty enterprises, which are really the single person firms, right? So a single person running a car, pushing a cart, or running a tea stall, things like that. That's a very large sink for surplus labor in a sense, that this is the default, right? Just as agriculture is a default employment sector for people who are not elsewhere, this is that part of the informal sector which sucks in people who do not get employment in other parts of the economy, formal or informal. And their problems are distinct again. There's a huge issue with displacement and dispossession that is peculiar to that part of the informal sector which is in public space, right? Vendors and so on, who have to face police harassment and municipal harassment, who don't have any fixed location of business, and so on. So a big part of this is getting identification for them, having vending zones and all of that stuff that maybe we'll talk about when we come to the policy concerns. So anyway, that's my kind of grand overview.
Thank you. I found this really, really helpful. Who else would like to add what you know about the size and complexity and heterogeneity of the informal economy? Deepankar or Matt, do you have any thoughts or comments?
Well, not at the moment, actually. I think I will talk about it to some degree when I.
Okay.
For me, there's a question maybe of organizing individuals and leveraging them. But when I talk, I come there. So.
Okay.
I wanted to add a point about the huge importance of having good data and having the documentation to understand trends in the informal economy. And here I have a specific suggestion. Now, as Amit mentioned, in India, a national commission on enterprises in the unorganized sector was formed in 2004. After the UPA, first version of UPA was formed, and because of the presence of the left and pushing for this kind of thing, it was formed, and it produced excellent reports on understanding the structure and changes in the informal economy in India. From 2006 onwards, when it started producing its reports, it came out with about a dozen reports. And it had very, very useful policy recommendations. The government just folded it up in 2009. Even its website has disappeared. So I think it is very important that people who work on the informal economy take the cue from the NCEUS and continue their work. And actually data that they use to think about the informal economy is available. And people who work on it should get hold of the data and continue their work.
If you were to put percentage figures on each of your boxes,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, that occurred to me last night, actually, as I was that I really should have done that.
Yeah.
but you slept instead.
Yeah, instead I chose to watch TV. No, so that's very true, and it's a one big missing part here.
I can
but, yeah.
try to walk you through some of it. I mean, what we showed was that if you take the self-employment, India is the country I know best, and I'm afraid the panelists know best, but it may obtain to other countries in the region. We know that the self-employed are 53%. Was that what it was in the figure?
Yes.
And the wage employed in the informal economy, 47. We do know that among the self-employed, the employers who hire others are less than 5%. The own account operators who don't hire others, sort of single person or heads of family firms, is a very large category in the self-employed. But unpaid contributing family workers is also quite large. So first would be own account, then the unpaid contributing family workers, and then only the employers. Among the informal wage workers, I don't know the percentage, but I do know that the percentage working for formal firms is actually growing. And because so few informal self-employed hire workers, I mean, the number of units is great and a lot, but where it's real growth is the informal employees, all of the subcontracting arrangements with the formal firms. Does that help? I mean, yeah.
I should point out that this is a real blur. I mean, there's a lot of good work on this blurring of wage workers versus self-employment, and this is a problematic category. One potential problem also is that there's a tendency to hide wage workers when you actually begin to enumerate. So you could underestimate it in that sense as well. To some real numbers really quickly, not absolute numbers, not percentages, which are a little old, but if out of a total informal workforce about 420 million, about 30 million are the informal firms, informal sector firms, informal workers, 30 million, and the rest are all in the agriculture, trade, trade and manufacturing and so on.
Yeah.
So about 250 million in agriculture, that leaves about 140 million workers we are talking about today, which are largely informal enterprise workers. And of that, the biggest is trade and services. 100 million odd workers are in trade and services. Manufacturing actually is only about 30 million or 40 million. So it's
And just two comments, and then I'll further on the data, just to pick up on Deepankar. The NCEUS work was really important, but a mainstream economist who I thought understood the informal economy dismissed it as a political project, right? And this is the first I knew that it's not even on the website anymore, and yet that kind of data becomes it's really important, and India's leading the pack actually on it, and so I do think we have to keep the pressure up for generating more data and doing the kinds of estimations that we've shared with you here. But yes?
Did you have any gender breakdown on these classifications with us? And also, did you include child labor? Is there any category for that?
Everyone needs, sorry, introduce yourself.
Hasna Maudud, I'm at Ash Center, Kennedy School.
From Bangladesh, yeah.
So another missing thing here. Now, I should point out that, well, this is all improvements for this. I'll make this my life's work. Well, home workers, the category of home workers, which is from the left, the third column, is very largely women. So that's the overwhelming, that sector is overwhelmingly women. And then on the way to the right, petty enterprises, a lot of women there too. Very few women in the middle in the entrepreneurs who hire wage workers. So women who hire wage workers are extremely tiny fraction of the informal sector. Most of them are working for themselves or are family help with men who run enterprises. So they get reported as helpers or something like that.
Full 30% of the female workforce in India is home-based.
Right.
Yeah, also in Pakistan. The share of women who are employers is low everywhere, but it's particularly low in South Asia. You have more women who are employers in Africa than you do in South Asia. We know the data comparatively. And so home-based, unpaid contributing family workers, domestic workers, other regions of the world, more women are street vendors than men, but not in South Asia. So we do have the breakdown, we just didn't present it all. Any other, yes, Matt?
I have so I like the chart very much. I also have an improvement in order to organize your lifetime achievement. I think it would be very helpful if you had a couple of examples of job descriptions, because at least at first reading, it's not really clear for me where to sort in, let's say, all categories of workers I have worked with. And then a second thing is it would be interesting to understand the power relationships between these, because if I'm not, how I understand it, let's say wage workers may well be employed in one of the other categories. And so if you have a policy intervention benefiting, for example, entrepreneur job workers or small-scale enterprise workers, they may, let's say the benefits of these interventions are easily at the higher level power. And so that makes it interesting to understand how they relate to each other.
That's a very good point. And the note I made on top of the handout for myself was actually, I forgot to point out, just like with agriculture, there are really two issues you're talking about. Class, gender, and caste dynamics within the informal sector, and then the relationship of the informal sector as a whole to the rest of the economy and the formal sector and the state. These are two very different issues. So the issues of wage workers who work in, let's say, power loom factories, the sector that I'm most familiar with, huge sector, a lot of wage workers in it. Their issues with respect to their employers are one set of very real issues, class dynamics. And then the issue of the power loom sector as a whole vis-a-vis the state or the rest of the economy, what they get from the larger units. Remember, a lot of this is global subcontracting chains. So by the time you get to the brand multinationals up here, you have a whole different value distribution problem. Right? So there's a kind of bargaining that these units are doing with the bigger brands, and then there's bargaining that happens within the firms, and these are all issues that are important.
Yes.
Name
and question.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the trust. Are we advocating for more regulations, or are we just basically talking about the different businesses? I come from a culture where you literally can rent your French truck, go out to the countryside, get coconuts in the truck, come into the tourist district, fill in, put some rum in them, and make the tourists happy the whole day long, with a little bit of ice in it. And I think if you look beyond that, I could feed my family with that. Okay?
Yeah.
If you look beyond that, it really raises the level of tourism in the country, I guess, and allows for people to be fed. What's wrong with that? I don't want the cops to come in and cut my business down. I'm throwing that back to you because I'm trying to see where we're going.
Well, we will have a policy part of the discussion,
Okay.
but I think my answer on the regulation is always appropriate regulation, because as I understand regulation from the point of view of informal workers, there's punitive and there's protective regulation. And what we know is that they're not outside the reach of punitive regulation, but what they're outside of is protective regulation. That's a very shorthand, so we'll get to that with the policy, but it is at the crux of the policy debate. Yeah. Any more comments on just getting hold of the size and, yes?
You can say a little bit more about the formal sector that economy in India? Are they large, domestic, multinational? Why is there a rise? What's shifted?
Well, I think we're talking not just India, many
you
parts.
mentioned specific
No, but it's
examples.
many parts
Yeah.
of the world. The public sector is contracting workers differently, and it's not just the private sector, right? And I don't think, I mean, there's so many gaps in the data understanding. We wouldn't be able to say what percentage of subcontracted workers in India work for a domestic supply chain versus a global supply chain. I think it would be really hard. They're in both, right? An interesting thing in Bangladesh, we all know, unfortunately, about the garment export industry and the factory workers. I've always been puzzled that we don't hear much about subcontracted home-based workers in the export garment industry in Bangladesh. So we've just done an exploratory study through BRAC University, and there is, of course, home-based subcontracted workers in the export garment sector. And the exploratory study suggests it's actually increasing, right? So there's so much more to learn. We're doing a scoping in Pakistan of home-based workers. Which supply chains are they in? Are there any recognizable brand names where, if you take it to the Ethical Trade Initiative, we just need to know so much more, so much more. Yes.
Hi, I'm Syed. I'm from NYU. I was just asking, since so much questions were asked about the breakdowns, I was thinking about the youth, like what is their breakdown, and for example, in entrepreneurs, like what is the percentage of youth entrepreneurs, in general in the informal sector, what is the steering role that they might be playing?
Yeah, and we also had the question on child labor. For the most part, when we're dealing with the data, we don't have the child labor in it because the labor force data starts with whatever the cutoff is in the country. But of course, most child labor are informally employed, right? On the youth, I think we're beginning to do more analysis by age cohorts of who's in self-employment, who's in wage employment, what industry branch. But I don't have it in my head. I wouldn't be able to say. But it's an important question because I think it's, since we're dealing with a huge youth unemployment challenge, seeing which industries youth come into and where they're located is important to understand the pathways out of unemployment for them. But I don't know enough by the age cohorts yet.
Yeah.
Do you, Deepankar?
No.
No.
Marty,
Yes.
I'm Nina Hewitt from
Yeah.
South Asian Institute. I think a follow-up to that too, in the breakdown of the caste, class, gender, do you have a sense of the income that these various categories would potentially be earning? And I think it has huge relevance as people are thinking about entering the informal sector where they may want to enter.
If there's choice.
If there's a
We
choice.
have a stylized, I didn't put it in, and it's a pyramid or an iceberg figure that I put together on the basis of 2 reviews of literature and statistics on informality around the world where we had earnings. And basically, if you think of this pyramid, at the top are the employers, then you have the informal employees, then they have the own account, then you have the casual day laborers, and then you have the sort of subcontracted workers. And wherever we've done the data, whether it's Africa or whatever, the only group in that that's above the threshold of minimum wage or poverty line on average are those who hire others. The own account workers do roughly what the informal employees do in terms of earnings, right? And then casual day laborers, and then the subcontracted. And we know that women are overrepresented among the subcontracted, men among the employers. And in South Asia, because of constraints, not so many women in the informal employee category, relatively. and more in the self-employed own account. So we have that stylized figures, and there's a lot of work going on, because if you have half the workforce of the informal is self-employed, what are the earnings of self-employed is not easily, income measures are problematic to begin with, but the earnings of self-employed are particularly hard.
Also, sorry, just to
Yeah.
add to that, the other big problem with, I know this for home working women from my primary work, is that most of this is piece rate work. So to actually figure out what her daily earnings are is not trivial, because there's no record of working hours or anything like that. So both the Sengupta Commission and my numbers roughly come out to around 30 to 40 rupees a day is what women earn. These are women who are at the bottom of they're
The
piece rate
subcontracted-
workers.
the piece rate,
The
yeah.
piece rate working women workers. Somebody who's doing embroidery work, or agarbattis, or whatever, things like that.
Yeah.
Cell phone chargers, stuff like
I
that.
just finished writing up a 3-city study on home-based work, which includes both the subcontracted and the self-employed. And the piece rates are stunningly low. And the thing about subcontracted work is the subcontracted worker pays for all the non-wage costs of production except the raw materials. So she provides the workplace, she pays for utilities, she buys the equipment, she maintains the equipment, she even has to buy some supplies. And she has to commute to the contractor, right? He doesn't come to her. And it's stunning. And we found out that if 1/3 of the cost goes for transport, so they're not just home-based, they're not homebound, right? They're having to go. And if they have to pay for transport, 1/4 operate at a loss, right? Yeah. And this is both the self-employed and the subcontract. I mean, so it's tough. It's a tough world particularly the subcontracted workers. Yes, Tarun.
I'm sorry, I came 10 minutes late.
Yeah.
I was intrigued by the comment about some data that was up on the web and dismantled, and it being potentially a political act, as you described earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, I think that itself is an interesting, this data is power, and you manage according to it. That itself seems to me to be very interesting, not directly related to this, but a very important phenomenon to understand. And it's particularly surprising in countries in South Asia which are awash in data of all sorts.
Yeah.
So I think about, what's the French gentleman's name in Delhi? Christophe. I mean, this guy collects every possible past data for the last 50, 60 years. So one would imagine that it would intersect with these. And I know there are all these large surveys that sample individual enterprises. Because Arshu Varshini and I wrote this one piece using it a long time ago on incidents of past entrepreneurship and things like that. So what is being dismantled, and does anybody know any more about this? If
Yes,
it's a
I
digression, then don't go down that road.
Well, I don't know the NCUS, but what I know about labor force data in many parts of the world is the World Bank and other donors have all their flavor of the month surveys, household surveys. So around the world, fewer and fewer countries are doing labor force surveys, right? Which are the basic, and you don't get enough information on employment in the living standards and others measurement surveys to get a picture that we're talking about. So it's hugely important that the funding community and others push for labor force surveys. If you do the labor force surveys, India has actually it's one of the better countries for it, right? But the tabulations then are not done according to pulling out these estimates of home-based and all that. It took a lead statistician retired. He had to use 4 different codes to get these estimations because the international system is premised on the idea that you have employers and employees. It's sort of the whole system of labor statistics, labor economics, is still on this global north model. We had the same discussion in the cities panel yesterday. So there's a huge amount of technical work that also needs to be done. I asked statisticians, where do you put casual day laborers? where do you put industrial outworkers? Because they're not in the classification system. For the most part, they put them under self-employed, right? Employees is a huge black box. So there's a lot of technical work that needs to be done. And then there's the politics. Who's in charge of labor force surveys in the world for the global system? It's the ILO. And the ILO is governed by formal workers, right? There's a resistance among both formal workers and employers to hide many of these workers, right? They don't want the data. So we have to create an alternative political force to ask for it. And what I learned working in India with the National Sample Survey is it's the economists who have to do it. But because they don't listen to the non-economists are not, we can go and make our little plea, but and the economists of India want to improve the income expenditure survey because there's this huge debate on poverty. And they say, why do we have to bother to know what the poor are doing? And I say, well, if you're going to eradicate poverty, you have to know what the poor are doing because earned income is the main pathway out of poverty, right? So that there's a huge, there's a lot of technical, political, and financial work that has to be done to get these. But I agree that statistics are power. And the reason the network I coordinate has a dedicated statistics program from the get-go is because statistics are power. It's really hugely important. So maybe, is there any other comment on this part of the discussion? Maybe we should move to the next part. Yeah, is that all right? We have a good understanding of the size and complexity. Yeah, okay. So this discussion is on part of the discussion is on some key conceptual and research questions. And Deepankar will lead off on a discussion on linkages.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about two kinds of linkages. One between the informal non-agricultural economy and the agricultural economy. And another is the linkage between the informal economy and the economy of large firms. So let me start with the first one. So most third world countries, and I'm most familiar with India, but whatever little I've seen, most third world countries are characterized by these two things. On the one hand, you have a huge agricultural sector which is dominated by very, very small agricultural plots, which are usually unviable if you do any kind of analysis. On the other hand, you have this huge workforce employed in the informal sector. Now, a question arises, is there a linkage between the two? So this is joint work that I'm doing with Amit, and we are still in the process of thinking the whole thing through. But we think that there might be some kind of vicious circle kind of linkage between the two which reinforces both. So our basic idea is the following. So if you start with the understanding that most people in the agricultural sector are working on plots of land which are unviable, the incomes that they generate are not enough for subsistence. So they have to look for non-agricultural work. So what kind of non-agricultural work is available? Well, informal work. What are the characteristics of informal work? They have very low wages, as we have just pointed out. And just to give a figure, I mean the poverty line in India in 2010 was 700 rupees per month for rural. So if you convert that using purchasing power parity, that is less than about $65 per month per person. So that's the amount of income that they are able to spend. So they have very low incomes, they have very little rights, but no collective bargaining rights, no social security. So in essence, it is all very precarious employment. So if they have very precarious employment, then even a very small plot of land holds a lot of insurance value, because in the face of fluctuating food prices, if you have even a small plot of land where you can grow a little part of what you consume, that allows you to have a little bit of food outside the logic of the market. So therefore, even though most of these plots of lands are unviable, most people are unwilling to give it up. So they do not want to sell it, and they are very strongly against acquisition. So we have seen lots of political movements against land acquisition. So what is going on is that these two things are reinforcing each other. So employment in the informal sector, low wages, precarious jobs, which is reinforcing them to hold on to small plots of land, and therefore there is no consolidation in the agricultural sector, therefore no technological change, therefore land productivity in agriculture is low, which leads to low income. So there might be a kind of vicious circle link which we need to explore. So we have just started thinking about this. The second linkage that I want to talk about is the linkage between the formal sector, big firms, and the informal sector. And the context for thinking about this comes from a lot of policy and research discussions which seem to suggest that if we can get the informal sector, small firms to link up with the large formal sector firms, then there might be technological transfer and productivity growth and technological dynamism in this huge pool of informal enterprises. Now, we are not really sure that it is a kind of straightforward link, and we think that the picture is more nuanced and there might be two different kinds of forces operating here. One, on the positive side, of course, if small firms get access to large firms, it solves many of their constraints, like demand constraint. Now they have an assured market where they can sell their product. It solves a lot of their problem of credit constraints, because a lot of these small firms are not able to borrow from the formal sector, and therefore they are not able to produce. So if they are linked to large firms, that problem is solved. They also get technology. So that is on the positive side. On the negative side, there are power relations. So large firms are usually able to move the terms of trade in their own favor, and therefore the smaller firms get less value for what they're producing. So we think that these kinds of two forces might be operating, and it's not just a one-way relationship. Now, we looked at the existing literature, and to the best of our knowledge, there is no study which looks at this issue at the firm level. There are a lot of interesting and recent studies which have tried to collect data at the industry level. And partly the problem is that you do not have data which allows you to link a small informal sector firm to a large formal firm. There is no data which will allow you to do that. So again, in some joint work that Amit, I, and another colleague of ours, Rajesh Bhattacharya, are doing, we have used data from the survey of unorganized manufacturing enterprises in India in 2005, and we have tried to see the determinants of subcontracting relationships and also the impacts. And what we find is a more nuanced picture. On the one hand, it is usually true that smaller firms are more able to benefit from subcontracting than larger firms. Firms which are located in rural areas are better able to benefit than firms which are located in urban areas, and firms which are located in industrially backward regions, which do not have a lot of industries, are better able to benefit from subcontracting. So we think that when we want to think about the importance of the linkage between subcontracting, small and large firms, there is a more nuanced picture than just one-way story that technological benefit will flow. Mm-hmm. So I'll just stop there and open it up for discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll hear Amit as well. There are 3 little presentations, and then we'll have the discussion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
Sure.
So.
Okay, so I thought I'd say a little bit about work that I've been doing. I'm generalizing from my own experience in the Banaras silk weaving industry, which is a fairly large industrial cluster, you can call it, in North India, which employs, I think the statistics as usual are not known because nobody's bothered to count them, but this is a very large industry. It probably employs somewhere around 150 to 200,000 workers. So we're talking about a decently sized industry. Based on this work, I want to talk a little bit about how to think about these kinds of informal industries. Right? So now we are moving away from the world of domestic servants, street vendors. Now imagine small workshops. These are home-based or attached to the home. right? So you have like maybe 3 or 4 workers, 5 or 6 wage workers, and an employer. And there's usually these are found in clusters, so that Banaras, for example, you'll find thousands of these textile firms in a small city, right? And there are many, many such clusters in India. Those who are from India would have heard of some of these names. There's the Agra leather cluster, there's the Tirupur knitwear cluster, there's the Moradabad metalwork cluster, there's power looms in Surat, there's hundreds of these industrial clusters, which are interesting from a research point of view because they combine quote-unquote traditional and quote-unquote modern institutions in very interesting ways, right? They all have artisanal roots, even though they may have modernized in the recent period. They all display kinship-based labor training regimes. So apprenticeship systems that are family-based or kinship-based is the predominant way in which the skilling of the workforce occurs. They display, again, traditional kind of methods of labor recruiting. So there's some interesting work that shows that even in faraway places, so when people go to Maharashtra, in a weaving town in Maharashtra, they will recruit by the same kinship rules that they used to do in Uttar Pradesh, where they've come from, right? So there's a translation of these kinds of traditional methods. A lot of credit financing, all that is traditional because there's no formal sector credit available. But there is a strong linkage to the formal sector through backward and forward linkages because equipment and materials come from the formal sector. Most of the informal weaving sector buys its yarn from the big factories, right? And it sells its fabrics to other big factories, which then convert it into garments and things like that. So there's backward and forward linkages to the modern sector. There's modern equipment. I've visited informal workshops in Banaras which have really, not state of the art, but fairly new weaving equipment and embroidery equipment and so on. So they're capitalized. They're not your sort of, minimal capital enterprises anymore that we're talking about. So there's a need to understand these kinds of enterprises. Sometimes the informal sector is divided into this survivalist and growth-oriented, needs-based, accumulation-based dichotomy. There are quote-unquote enterprises that are purely people trying to earn a living and a livelihood, no interest in expansion, no interest in accumulation. And then there are these other kinds of firms that I'm talking about, which are very much into capital accumulation. And we know very little about capital accumulation at this level. I mean, one person who's done some really good work in this is Barbara Harris-White, through her sort of regional economies kind of work. And so we need a lot more work to understand how capital is accumulated in small firms. How is it reinvested, right? What can we do to enable better accumulation and reinvestment? Because as Professor Chen was saying, a lot of this regulation that they're subject to is punitive regulation and not regulation that will enable them to do things, right? So there's a lot of clandestine activity. You're stealing electricity, or you're doing other kinds of things which you're doing just because there's the costs of doing it any other way are very high, right? Now that's of course counterproductive. For example, in Banaras, the power loom sector steals electricity. As a result, there's such weight on the grid that it collapses all the time, right? So you have days of power outage. This is an industrial town based on the industry is based on electricity, and it's routine to find 4 days of no electricity, right? So there's this kind of you get these collective phenomena which are counterproductive for everyone because individually rational actors are doing these things of circumventing regulations. So we need to understand, how these clusters can be. In the 90s, there was a big literature on growth, how these clusters can grow and how there's the way of the future and so on. And not much has been done really for most of these clusters to help them modernize in any significant way. And in the last part, in the policy section, I'll talk about some of these intellectual property right-based approaches to fostering cluster growth. So I'm going to defer that for now. But just going to point to our inability to really say a whole lot about how these clusters are working. One very interesting aspect of this is how they communicate with each other, right? How the innovation and inter-firm knowledge flows. If you look at surveys of there's one survey that was conducted of small-scale industry about 10, 15 years ago in India. One of the questions was, what's your source of knowledge or R&D or something like that was the question. And 90% of the firms fell in the category of no source. Right? That The idea was, is it foreign R&D, is it domestic R&D, or do you have no source? So most of them said no source, because there's nothing to capture this, how knowledge is being generated. Right? If it doesn't fall into one of these ready-made categories of the formal sector kind of perspective. So in Banaras case, the selling point of the industry is fabric designs. Right? So firms compete on being able to make new designs, and firms steal from each other all the time designs. And there's some work now going on about how hyper competition of this kind is again counterproductive, right? Because nobody gets any rents, there are no property rights. So you're secretive, you guard your design with your life, you produce it. Once it's in the market, it takes a few months for it to spread and to imitate and to saturate the market. Your rents are gone then. And then again the cycle begins to innovate. Now that's very good for consumers because they're getting a lot of variety for very cheap. Right? But it's not necessarily very good for the industry, which is not able to capture many of these rents that it should be. Now, whether the entrepreneurs would pass it on to workers in the form of higher wages is a different story. Right? That involves us. But if they don't have it, then they certainly can't pass on what they don't have. Right? So, so that's definitely we should be worrying about that. I think I'll stop here and then continue.
Good. All right, thank you. There is one more topic, but let's open it up on these two rich sets of themes from Amit and Deepankar. Any elaborations, any comments, any questions?
I have a question. So
Yes.
there was something that I didn't understood. Someone like kind of like the opposite. And I think it was Amit who said that larger firms would usually win in the power relationship over a small firm. But on the other hand, I understood you said that smaller firms would benefit more from subcontracting. And maybe you can elaborate how that relates to each other.
Okay, so I mean this is an empirical analysis we carried out using this survey of unorganized manufacturing enterprises, and we can divide up the sample into very small firms which employ essentially no workers, no wage workers, and then there are middle-sized firms which employ 5, 10, and then there are bigger firms which employ more than 10. Now what we were interested in is, does the subcontracting relationship, the impact of subcontracting relationship vary across the size of the firm? And what we found very surprisingly is that very small firms benefit if they get into it in terms of productivity growth versus very large firms which employ 10 or more. Now the way we try to explain is to say that subcontracting entails two opposing forces. One is when you get into subcontracting, it removes your credit constraints, demand constraints, and technological constraints. On the other hand, you are at a disadvantage because the larger firm might turn the terms of trade against you. Now, what will be the overall outcome depends on the strength of these overall forces, two forces. And we think that the smaller firms benefit because the positive aspect dominates the negative. And that was our justification.
Any other comments, questions?
Is
Yes.
there any room for social cost? For example, accidents, insurance, who bears that cost? Because this is a part of the, I mean, if you look at it, it's not just wages and profit, but there are other costs involved, human life, for example. Who bears that and how to put it in your plan?
Nobody, I mean,
Well,
the person has to bear the cost. So because there is no public provisioning of insurance, all kinds of accidents and costs related to any unplanned accidents, disasters, will be borne by the individual. So, I mean, economists divide the total value added into profits and wages, and for the people who are employed as the own account employers, there is that one total value added, and that goes to defraying all kinds of costs, including cost of healthcare, accidents, any kind of cost.
By definition, they're not they tend not to be covered either through an employer or through the state. And now there's some exceptions where the state will have, like in Thailand now, there's universal health care. The third, fourth pillar is to cover the informal workers. But that is not accidental disability.
Does the state or those who are earning a lot of money through these industries, is there any obligation, any social commitment? Like if there was social business, who would bear these expenses?
But there are movements, of course, the ethical and fair trade movements as a whole, to try to put more pressure on the companies to share risks rather than download risks. But that only covers a small share.
Well, one thing on this is we don't understand a lot of how, let's say, for example, in the case of Banaras, big entrepreneurs, right? They have these community claims on them. Oftentimes they come from the same community as the workers and so on. So there's a discourse of you are the successful big man, so you have to do something for the community. And so you open a hospital or you open a school. And you see a lot of that. And this is again part of that whole how is small town capital functioning. Right? So that kind of private philanthropy and so on is actually quite important in a context where the state is not really there. So in the Banaras case, these are all Muslims, Muslim weavers, and they would suffer from certain kind of social exclusion just by being fact of being Muslim. So there, the capital accumulated in the sari industry being turned around to deliver schooling or hospitals acquires a certain kind of significance. Now, obviously, this doesn't absolve the state of its duty, right? Philanthropy is not a substitute for that. But from the research perspective, this has to be understood, how it is operating.
Yes.
You want to switch yours or something, right?
Yes.
Khanna Sultana from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. So I think my question piggybacks on the previous one in the sense that when we think about accountability and social safety nets, I mean, the example of Rana Plaza, you know, Walmart, H&M, and all these big corporations that subcontracted out. So none of these large corporations are taking responsibility. There's been no compensation paid over a year, and they're still trying to work out an ethical trade agreement, right? So when we think about that's formal. There are formal garments, activities going on, but so much of it was informalized. And even within the formal, there are ways to not have accountability. So you don't have to compensate. You don't have to take the risk. So there are points of, there are points where you can have risk sharing, but I think there's also a lot going on that we're not seeing in sectors that employ large number of people. Whereas if we want to go into a different genre of literature called CSR, corporate social responsibility, that's more on ecological, environmental action, right? And not so much on cheap disposable labor.
Right.
But I think when we think about these issue about subcontracting and all the layers, so your handout is really useful, but even within a formal thing like the RMG, ready-made garments industry, right? There's so many layers of it and so many ways people can find loopholes to exploit and therefore accuse themselves.
Right. Yeah, I'm good with that.
Tarun?
One comment on Husna's question. I think India is engaged in a very interesting first-time experiment, I think, anywhere in the world, which is legislated responsibility. And it sometimes is an insane idea. It's to say that all publicly traded enterprises above a certain threshold have to pay money towards social responsibility. And of course, immediately you know that most will evade it in some way. But there are a goodly number of enterprises, including public sector enterprises, that are actually sitting on billions of dollars of undispensed reserves, and at least are starting to think about how to use it productively. And some of that might be deployed in my happy imagination, I think, in vocational issues, training. Some of it might be deployed in safety issues. But this is a debate that's up for grabs, and it's moved beyond the formal sector opposing it to now some sort of resignation that it exists at all. And so either we decide to evade it, which is probably some of the discussion I imagine, or we first time in any country that anybody has actually passed a law saying that you shall be responsible. And of course, some people say that, well, then it stops being social responsibility, it becomes tax. That's fine,
Yeah.
or whatever it is, but it's a very interesting.
Well, just to add though, but India and I think Pakistan and maybe Bangladesh have these welfare funds, which are also a tax on industry for workers in specific industries, right? And under the welfare boards, those workers, if they know about these funds, and if they're organized, can get school scholarships and some health provisions and some skills training. So there's some patchwork of measures out there. Yes?
Yes, I'd like to further comment on what you and Hassan is talking about the healthcare situation. My name is Peter Zandaran.
Mm-hmm.
And you use the example of Thailand was brought up, but people need to remember that in Thailand you have an enlightened private sector, namely from the royal family. And many should recall that the current king of Thailand was born right down the street from here. And this past December, we had the spectacle of the king of Thailand sitting from his hover-round, wearing glasses, reading a speech, calling for an end to the violence going on mainly in Bangkok. Now, a century ago, this would have been unthinkable, but you have the person of the king of Thailand, someone who not only ensures health care for everyone for people in the country, but even contributes to healthcare systems even in America. Now when you publicize something like healthcare, the general public does not always understand proper healthcare, and that is something people should. If you make universal healthcare, you're going to invite people to participate who have no real knowledge of what proper healthcare, proper hygiene is, and that's.
Right. Any other comments? Yes. Yeah.
My name is Ashish Kulur. I work on the post-2015 development agenda at the UNCSD. And all these things are within the 126 targets identified across 19 thematic issues of the post-2015 agenda, social protection for informal workers and all these kind of things. But I just want to talk about an interesting example I came across while I was working with some manufacturing units in Muradabad actually, and we were working on compliance mechanisms. There was a significant proportion of the labor force that opted not to be in informal employment contracts with the employers, because the compliance for minimum wage was so low that if they had to contribute to the PF and all these kinds of things, their take home would be nothing. It would not be sufficient and not qualify as a living wage. So in the short run, they actually saw no utility in these kinds of things. And like that particular setup was more ethically inclined. So they had a private hospital which they ran on a charitable basis for the employees, so they were able to do this. But I just thought it was a very interesting thing that they opted out and they didn't want to. So how does that fit into this whole thing? What's the way forward? In addition to increasing the minimum wage, of course.
Right. I think later on you have this thing on what informal workers need or want. One of the themes. So maybe they don't need a formal contract or don't want one, and that's something. I guess it's an empirical question.
Right.
You can't really assume there's a lot of specificity to this. Yes, I agree with that.
Yes, one more, and then we'll have our coffee break. Yeah, or tea break.
About how the trends, how you see some of the trends moving, and the example you used the bananas example of the soul food industry. Like my entire family's from Conjurum, which is a major soul fooding. It's a soul fooding sort of pocket. So my entire family's soul fooders, and my parents went to school and college based on these scholarships that some of these firms packed their workers, but for my generation, that's completely gone, and sort of moving away from that model. And what if we see that in any other sort of situations?
Well, this might be the big difference between Tamil Nadu and Eastern Uttar Pradesh. These are two very different worlds. So I mean, this Banaras is East UP, which is practically Bihar in many ways, and it is a very different situation there. And plus, we're talking about Muslims, so it's a further marginalization. In Banaras, there is very little movement out, except in the way of going to Surat and Bhiwandi and other powerloom workshops. So there's a big migration from Banaras to other powerloom centers for weaving, and exodus into other informal sector occupations. But otherwise, and I was going to mention this briefly when we come to the last policy section, there's a huge surplus labor problem. People can't leave. There's nowhere to go. And that is a big part of why wages are so low and so on as well. So we've seen much less of this kind of movement there. And I don't know much about Kanjivan, so I'm very interested to hear more later maybe about this.
There's been a huge change just because of urbanization.
Right.
So, we know that context matters everywhere, but maybe it matters more in South Asia. Anyway, let's have our coffee break and we'll come back for the policy part of the discussion. Yeah? So this is going to be the policy challenges part of the discussion. And I'm just going to go back to one slide. Regulation and taxation is the standard response to informality, okay? And this I put under research and questions, because I think we really have to unpack regulation and taxation and informality. So these are just alternative hypotheses that really we need to test in our research. One pair, stringent labor regulations drive informality, but there may be other regulations that actually drive informality. Number two, informal self-employed choose to operate informally to avoid the costs of regulation. Maybe they also operate informally out of necessity or out of tradition. There may be other things driving it. Informal enterprise workers are outside the reach of government regulations, and I referred to this alternative hypothesis earlier, that they're outside the protective arm of government but inside the punitive arm. And the reason I can say that with some authority is that I do know that in cities that have not issued licenses or permits to street vendors of late, they are treated under the Indian Penal Code. The police are authorized to treat them criminally under the Indian Penal Code. And the municipal acts also allow them to be treated as criminals. Taxation and informality, alternative hypotheses. One is that informal self-employed evade taxes, and the other, of course, is that informal self-employed pay a variety of fees and taxes, but do not receive the commensurate benefits. So I just put that out there. I think we need to really unpack the regulation taxation issue. So we have otherwise 3 sets of comments on alternative policy challenges. So Amit on skills and intellectual property rights.
Right. So I'll just make 2 very quick points. One, to go back to what I said earlier in terms of skill acquisition. This is one of those areas, again, in the informal sector research, which is a little bit under-researched compared to things like wages and working conditions and so on, which we do know a fair bit about. We don't know as much about how labor is trained. Right? And there's a kind of general notion that the informal sector is basically the home of unskilled work. Right? And you'll find statements to this effect. Most surveys kind of lead to that conclusion too, because most of the informal sector workers have no formal education or very little formal education. And when even the NSS asks questions directly about training, it usually receives negative responses. So I've done some work analyzing NSS data on this, and most of the times workers fall in the category of no training. No vocational training, no formal training, no informal training. So it's hard to know what is it then, because my argument is that the low wages should not be taken as a signal for low skills, which is the usual kind of logic applied, that low skills and low productivity, therefore low wages, and then low wages can be used to infer low skills. I think surplus labor is a very large part of the low wages story in the informal sector. In other words, in conditions where labor is in surplus, it's very hard for labor to win any productivity gains because there's just too much pressure, excess supply of labor. And so in Banaras, for example, although power looms increase productivity a lot, most of that doesn't really translate into increased wages. So there's a lot of that kind of thing. So I think the policy framework has to recognize that there is skill in the informal sector. And these workers are not unskilled workers. Some of them are spending months or years gaining skills. And their wages should be commensurate with that. Now, how we do that and so on is a different issue. And I think solving the surplus labor problem obviously is part of the story. And Deepankar is going to talk about labor-intensive industrialization in just a few minutes. But in terms of a discourse shift, not so much the economy, but the discourse shift, how do we look and understand, how do we talk about these workers? And that needs to move. Right? So the National Knowledge Commission, for example, which has been around for a few years, to my knowledge, hasn't really taken up this issue with the way that it could. It couldn't really make a difference. It could point to the informal sector and say, there's a vast store of knowledge here that we've just not acknowledged or ignored. How do we deal with that? Right? How do we talk about it? And they haven't done that. They've done some reports on indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, medicines and forest dwellers and things like that. That's there. But at large, the informal economy, the manufacturing sector, it's missing. So that's one set of issues to do with recognizing skills and talking about them. The other is this, I just wanted to quickly highlight this one type of intellectual property right or legislation that is being proposed as a solution to a lot of informal sector problems, and that is this Geographical Indication Act, which is been sold in a big way by UNCTAD, and India seems to have gone in for it in a big way. So last night, I was actually not watching TV. I was counting up all the geographical indications issued to craft-based or artisanal industries in India, and I counted 217 in a 10-year period between 2004 and 2014. And these are all, again, names that we all know, like Agra and Moradabad, or they all come up again. Kanjivaram is there, Banaras is there. So there are all these clusters that have been identified. And the reason GI, the geographical indication, is supposed to be relevant is it's a communal property right. So it's given to a region, right? So like Darjeeling or Champagne or Rockford or something like that. So it's usually associated with agricultural products, but in India it's being used for crafts. So you say this area is unique for this skill. And we're going to say you can't sell something as Banarasi or Kanjivaram unless it's made over there. And it's intended to create a rent out of this brand identity, right? And avoid imitation, and which is rampant. Imitation is rampant in these industries. China, for example, manufactures Banarasi saris and sells them as Banarasi. People in Banaras sell Chinese saris as Banarasi saris. So all that stuff is there, and the GI is meant to take care of that. Now, I'm not going to go into great details, but there's some caution required here, because some of these GIs have been defined very, very narrowly. Right? They kind of take existing practice and say, this is the right way to do this. And so seek to freeze it in a way. Right? So instead of just acknowledging that all of these art and industries have changed a lot over the years, right, to markets and other pressures. And what is really worth preserving is this genius that creates these kinds of clusters and keeps them operating. It's not necessary to freeze them in the name of kind of craft preservation or whatever, and say you can't really change from here on. So in the Banaras case, if you're a power loom producer, then you're not making Banarasi. If you're a handloom producer, then you are. Right? Although you may be coming from the very same milieu and have transitioned from hand to power, you lose the right to call it that, because Banarasi has been defined as hand. Now, okay, so maybe there's a traditional aspect here, but we need to think carefully about whether that is the way we want to go about preserving these. So I'll stop there.
I'm just going to do one little segue. One of the concerns that I've had is that some of these industrial clusters are actually slums, and they're not recognized as industrial clusters, and then they're evicted and dislocated and all of that. So the most recent example I had of that, I have a little clipping, and it's street artists in Delhi trying to save a slum. And it's puppeteers and fire eaters and acrobats and drummers and somebody, it's called a magician's ghetto. But the point is, it is an artisanal cluster, right? And do we treat all such clusters as just slums that need to be evicted because they look like a sore eye? I stayed with an artisan in Ahmedabad for 2 days, who also a street vendor, and their colony was divided in half by a road. But it was a famous colony in New Ahmedabad for artisans. So it's not just the property rights, but how that whole cluster is, and turning slums into industrial clusters is my mantra.
And just picking you back on that, the one big issue, for example, with this is converting slums into high rises, right? And then you get these phenomenon of the slum dwellers selling the flat and going back to the slum, which opens up for the the standard middle class criticism: why should we build them flats when they sell them and go back to live, because they like living in the slum? And a lot of people have now discussed, this is not news. Space, horizontal space is important for all of this activity. You can't be living on the 13th floor and doing all this work. So if you fail to understand this commercial aspect of the slum and you think of it as a place where people live, then your solution is to just stack them up, and they don't want to do that.
Yeah, the line here is, what will the acrobats do with their stilts in a small flat? And some have drums that weigh 80 kilograms each, right? So keeping them on the ground floor. We're going to continue with the next. So labor-intensive industrial, that'll absorb all of that surplus labor, right?
That's the hope.
Okay.
Actually, before I say a few things about labor-intensive industrialization, I just wanted to mention a very interesting strand in the economics literature that talks about this regulation issue that Professor Chen mentioned. So there was a very famous paper published in 2004 by two LSE economists who used data from across Indian states, and they showed, quote unquote, that states which have higher regulation perform worse. And this was a study which was very, very highly quoted, and it became a kind of paradigm for people to do research. Two Indian economists from Delhi School of Economics looked at how they had constructed the measure of regulation and pointed out that it was flawed. And those papers, of course, were not published in international journals, but in Indian Journal of Labor Economics. But they really demolished the argument. And there is a lot of research which has gone after that, which shows that there is no very strong linkage between tight regulation and manufacturing sector not performing well. In fact, there was some very interesting surveys of managers of manufacturing enterprises who were asked, what are the major constraints you face? They talked about credit constraints, they talked about demand constraints, they talked about infrastructure constraints, but none of them mentioned labor regulation as an important constraint. So this, it has not percolated down to the policy debate. People still think that if you have tight regulation, that will not lead to growth of the manufacturing sector. The evidence does not support that. I just wanted to mention that. Now coming to labor intensive industrialization. Now here I want to mention 2 or 3 small points. One, I'm talking about a macro perspective, thinking about growth of economies on a very long period of time. And here I'm borrowing from very interesting work done by Danny Roderick, economist who was here at Harvard, now he's moved to Princeton. He's done very interesting work on development and growth. And the point he makes with lot of evidence is that countries which have grown or which have managed to sustain growth over long periods of time has done that because they have managed to move a large section of the workforce from low productivity work to high productivity work. The other way economies can grow is if there is technological change and productivity growth within the sectors, within agriculture, within industry, within services. But the major difference between countries which have and which have not grown is the shift of labor. And that is why it is important for large section of the workforce in countries like India, which is now engaged in low productivity work either in agriculture or in the informal sector to move to higher productivity work. And that's why labor intensive industrialization is necessary to absorb all this surplus labor. As Amit mentioned, if you have a huge pool of surplus labor, the bargaining power of labor is very low, and whatever productivity growth happens does not go to them, it is captured by capital. So all kinds of reasons suggest that it is imperative to have a strategy to absorb this surplus labor. Now here again there is an interesting difference, and again this is a point that Professor Chen mentioned. When we look at the manufacturing sector over the last 2-3 decades, a very interesting trend is observed, and that is that these large firms, so by large firms I mean firms which employ more than 100 workers, those firms have not employed even one more organized sector worker. So all the employment generation, net employment generation in these large firms is of a casual nature. And all the other employments have been generated in small firms, the informal enterprises that Amit and Professor Chen talked about. So if we think of the policy concerns that should be there when we think about labor intensive industrialization, there are two issues to think about. One, how to have a policy framework which will enable these large firms to employ workers not as casual laborers. So what are the reasons why these large firms are not employing workers as regular workers? Why are they employing all these people as casual workers? So is it because they are facing some constraint? What are those constraints? So those are some sets of issues that we need to think about. The other set of issues is related, and that is that all the employment generation has taken place in the small informal firms. These informal firms have very low productivity. So what are the ways in which you can enhance the productivity of these workers which can increase their incomes, and possibly part of that will go as wage income. So if we think about labor intensive industrialization, these two kinds of issues which are related but also separate needs to be thought about. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to Matt, who has 3 slides, I believe, or 4 slides.
Something like that.
He's going to talk about cities and, yeah?
Maybe
Sort?
more general, I think.
More general, okay.
More general.
All right. And you can also refer to his handout. I think the slides relate to the handout. This very complex handout chart.
So the good thing of this page is that all questions and all solutions are on here. So until when the slide is up, basically I will talk, I'm at the GSD right now on sabbatical. I'm usually an international development consultant who works independently, and I will talk mainly about a contract that I had with the Gates Foundation, where I was asked to evaluate the impact of member-based organizations of informal workers, and the impact that these organizations have on their members as well as on the poor at large. And so as part of that, I also evaluated multiple projects which are under the Vigo umbrella. And you can put the next slide. And so that study had basically 7 key findings, and that was that MBOs, member-based organizations, significantly improve the quality of life of their members. And I could establish a proxy of in-cash and in-kind income increases that was between 50 and 200% as compared to people who would not benefit from these MBOs. And then these income increases, they were usually cumulative, and they would come about through multiple interventions. So increases in cash income, for example, through collective production, they would be able to structure the production procedures more efficiently. They would be able to negotiate higher piece rate wages, and they would also have more working days because they would be able to access markets more easily. And then maybe each of them would be like a 5 or 10% increase in income, but so they keep adding up. And so then there's a second area where the positive impact derives from. This is like the kind of services that member-based organizations provide to their members. And for example, they may offer like a sort of health insurance, or they may help members to enroll in like food assistance programs that are usually not accessible otherwise. And so if you add all of this up, you would get to these 50 or even more % income increase. And then another important function is so that these MBOs, they exist like as local groups, and then they're federated in the city level, and then the the provincial level, the state level, the national level, and then even the international level. And these different levels, they would basically fulfill various functions. So the international level would help to transfer best learnings or lessons from one country, like a strategy that had proved successful to negotiate with the government or with a private sector middleman, and to transfer it to another region. At the local level, and then the national level, they would do the same but within the country, and they would also help to scale up a policy that helped successful in one city and to transfer it to other cities, etc. And at the local level, they are usually, let's say, the experimentary laboratories, how to innovate policies, and then also how to deliver services and link members with the state programs, etc. So they are like kind of the action, the local action hub. And so if you go to the next slide, just do the next one more. Okay. So based on these results, I came up with this one page which tells it all. And so the first step of this page was to show that this is not, let's say, why people are poor. This is not like a straight, it's not a linear relationship. So people, first thing which I try to line out, informal workers may be trapped in poverty because they don't have high income, so they can't save anything, they can't accumulate capital, and so because of that they have a low productivity, and so then this keeps going around. And so if you go to the next slide, so why do they have low incomes? One possible answer is they have a low productivity. Another, they cannot appropriate their income because they lose it due to external factors, which Marty refers to as high risks and costs. And then on the other hand side, they may have a poor asset base because they get actively excluded from redistribution programs, or they get passively excluded, and I will now explain what each of these means. And so you can read basically on your sheet of paper. I wasn't able to lay out that for a PowerPoint. So basically, so the productivity may be low because of low human capital, poor health, poor education, or low physical capital, poor access to land, like informal land tenure, no access to basic services and infrastructure like water and sanitation, or poor access or poor chances or opportunities to run productive machinery because we're excluded from electricity in a slum, etc. Or you just don't have access to financial capital. And then there are the high risks and costs, so which can be individually health risks, or they can be exposure to natural hazards or financial debt. And then there are state-induced risks like corruption and harassment through the police of street vendors, for example, or very high taxes but no service. It's like the kind of penalizing policy that Marty lined out, rather than a supportive policy where you pay taxes or user fees, but you also get something that allows you to overcome a collective action problem. And then high insecurity of rights, so you may just be excluded in many ways. And then there are market-induced risks, so you, depending on your situation, you may not be able to link to a market because there's no middleman, or like there's a middleman, but he may exploit or she may exploit you. And on the other hand side, so there's like the poor access to government resources, and so there can be either like an active exclusion because politicians are not willing to target resources or at marginalized populations, or it can be like a softer form of exclusion. They just don't know how to deliver to you. They may not know that you exist. So many slums are actually white spots on maps, and so the same people don't know. This is the importance of data that Marty headlined out. People don't know how many street vendors there are, or where are the markets, and how to actually then support them is of course not it's not possible. And then there may be like other constraints, like a city government may just not have resources to overcome land tenure problems in a slum, or like they may not have the technical capacity to do anything about it because they just don't understand the actual problem in the first place or how to tackle it. And so if we go to the next slide, so this is where all the solutions are basically. On the left-hand side, there's basically you build the capacity of the urban poor and you organize them in the member-based organizations that I reviewed for the Gates Foundation. And then this member-based organization will be able to organize the workers collectively and to basically improve their production or reduce their costs linked to public schemes or like supply schemes themselves. And you are also able to tackle the active or passive inclusion by providing the data. And even if like this is like an active inclusion, then you can have like protests, sit-ins, etc. in order to overcome these constraints. And it's more tricky if it's about the passive exclusion, or like both are tricky in their own way. But like building the capacity and like coming up with the data, coming up with this is a supportive policy rather than an exclusionary policy. So you need like best. I don't like the word best practices, let's say, but let's say there are like good lessons that you can transfer from one place to another, etc. And so this is like where you like come up with like zoning regulations that support a slum as an industrial cluster, rather than saying this you cannot have anything else but residential, and like the slum itself may not exist in the first place. And you come up with like positive forms of taxation and user fees in exchange for services or access to infrastructure. And yeah, so can we do one more slide? Okay, so yeah, I guess so my main question that I phrase is, so how can we be more strategic about helping informal workers to organize? And so this basically, it primarily relates like to of Amit's graph. It's like, I need to get it right. So it's mainly about this side where like people are like in like informal businesses themselves rather than being informal worker for the formal business. There is like maybe like unionizing or whatever like may happen. But so this graph is more like how do you organize the people that are completely by themselves? And then there are these questions where I asked earlier where there are like micro enterprises that employ other people, and so if you like promote the micro enterprise and make it more successful, the benefits may mainly accrue to the people who are on top of this, like individual, like or like small picture command chain. And so it's like if you organize them in cooperatives, etc., then this may be more successful or more inclusive. And so these are the lessons that I have drawn from that review for the Gates Foundation. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, let's open it up. We have just 10 minutes to work on how do we address the policy challenges of informality in South Asia. So, yes?
Well, there are actually kind of 3 points that I want to touch on. One, when you brought up the subject of artistic slums, you have 2 excellent examples of artistic slums locally here in Cambridge and one in Providence, Rhode Island. In Providence, you have artists living in slum communities, but those artists are given tax-exempt status, which encourage them to produce. And I haven't heard about any whether artists in Asia are given similar status. In Cambridge, I mean, right around here, you have many people many street artists, some with a lot of talent do their work, but when they go to some college campuses like MIT or around here, the administration and the campus security either trespass them or arrest them just for sharing their work with members of the academic community. Now, there are two other informal economies I have not heard, which make a major contribution to South Asia and are, in a way, a kind of strength, but they have sort of weaknesses. One, since the last workshop we talked on Gujarat. I mean, Gujarat is also famous for having the Alang ship-breaking yards. I mean, there most famously you had them scrap the Soviet missile cruisers, but also most famously, people forget that not only while you have children working for $1 a day and dying there, also admirals, captains, ministers from not just from India but around the world can go there, and they studied ship design, not just from ships like the ones I mentioned, but most famously the USS Bennington and the France. And that is, they've used that to turn India into a power which has been superior in many ways to NATO and the West. And you also have, we're starting to see this model being emulated in Indonesia, Pakistan, all throughout Asia. I mean, while it's good technologically, no one's addressed the issue of the child labor is not being addressed. And the one last other industry is the counterfeiting industry economically. I mean, most famously, you have a lot of the Raj coinage from India, British India, mainly gold sovereigns from the Raj rulers, silver coinage, which are counterfeited. I mean, not only is it a criminal enterprise, I mean, in a way it's understandable as a form of revenge for over a century of colonialism, but it also has prevented India and Asia from developing a strong economy. I mean, here's a place where Asia can challenge the world, and instead they're not developing it.
Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering, in your research and the data collection that you've done, have you also investigated practices by important, like large NGOs like Spark, who have actually done worker awareness programs in slums in Mumbai, where they have made the workers aware of their rights? They have in fact been able to institute programs for worker health, like they've asked or they've forced the municipality to collaborate with some of these informal enterprises to give their workers health benefits. So they have instituted an annual checkup program. They have instituted vacation rights for benefits, like including vacations throughout the annual vacation cycle. So have you, I mean, this is kind of a grassroots way of
Right. Well, it relates to, yeah, I think what we'll do is, it's an important question, just take whatever the last questions are, and then ask the panel to just close, because we are running out of time. Yes?
So it's linked to what you're asking, the role of NGOs. Sir Amit referred to the role of BRAC in doing a lot of this kind of, service provision. And I don't know if anyone was here this morning when I talked about water, sanitation, and slums. And it's usually the NGOs who are fulfilling the role and working more closely with the informal economy than the government. But I'm wondering if by having civil society or activists or other more professionalized NGOs doing that is making the state and other entities, corporations, whoever, take a backseat and say, we don't need to get involved if somebody else is doing that.
Let them off the hook.
So I wonder if it's an incentive, but it is incentive.
Any other final questions or comments? Yes.
So, the ILO says, implement social protection flows for unemployed, all these things. So, it's out there, but I guess, the challenge in these cases is national policy. And I don't know if someone is looking at what group are the informal workers being compared to, the state of universal healthcare in India is anyway pathetic. So, what do you so what standard are you holding the unemployed, the informal workers to? You have to compare the floor and the ceiling. So I don't know where that analysis fits in terms of what the specific bottlenecks are or what specifically needs to be done. Yes, it needs to be done, but what is the threshold that's being taken as
the standard?
Yeah,
Where's the bar?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tarun?
Just on that point, maybe it's the same thing, but what are the mechanisms through which whoever is setting these rules That strikes me as being a leverage point where one knew ahead of time what those were. Then an organized group could influence.
Okay, I think I'll ask Matt to speak first because he has parental duties. He's going to. Yeah.
Parental duty.
Okay. His alarm went off. He needs to go.
So basically, very, very quickly, so I don't, also for the Gates Foundation, I reviewed Slum Dwellers International and Spark as a member of them, but I didn't evaluate Spark because they have been evaluated so many times, so we went to other countries. And basically, it's like, it's a similar point that I'm trying to make there. So SDI or these affiliates, Spark, the National Slum Dweller Federation, they are basically an MBO, and they can fulfill multiple functions. And so they are able to train their members, like SEBA is doing this with the Kamika School for Women Construction Workers, for example. And they can also go to the slums in order to improve the productivity and reduce health hazards, which is all basically two sides of the same coin. And I think these interventions are highly successful. Of course, they have like drawbacks. It's not easy to organize the poor, and you just do it like this. It's very resource intensive, and sometimes you go one step to the front and 2 steps back. But in general, I think that is like the path to go down, and that would be like my recommendation and my question, like how to support that.
Okay. Amit?
Oh,
just in response to any of the questions.
Well, I mean, there's, in response to the question about the floor versus the ceiling, I guess there's two. So there's issues on which the existing legislation or policies are good, but all the problem is in implementation. And then there are issues where there's just not proper understanding to make the policies. And there's a distinction between those two. There are a lot of well-intentioned stuff on the books which could be implemented with great effect. Minimum wage legislation, things like that. But then there's kinds of stuff like with slum policies or with the skill stuff that I talked about, where there is just the lens to look at it is wrong in the first place. So we have to distinguish between those two things. And the question of organizing is really the key in most of these industries. Right? And it used to be that organizing was limited to the formal sector, but that's not the case anymore. We have some really good examples of informal sector unions. They may be things like SEVA, they may be things like the domestic workers unions that we have in many places, sex workers unions. There's all kinds of informal sector unions out there now. But this work is very hard. And this is where most of the implementations sort of rubber hits the road kind of thing. Like the brick kilns. So we have a mutual acquaintance who's been organizing brick kiln workers around Hyderabad. And this is very dangerous work. I mean, you're basically talking about people who lose your life organizing these workers. These are bonded workers from Orissa who are brought over to the...
So you're saying the work is dangerous, but the organizing is also dangerous.
The organizing is very dangerous. The work, of course, is dangerous.
Yeah.
But those are people who have no choice.
Yeah.
The organizers are often people with choices. And that's where it gets more complicated. But that's equally as dangerous in many instances. But without that, there is really no use doing the legislation is not going to implement itself.
Yeah.
So kind of continuing what Amit said, I think there are some developments on the more positive side also, and that also comes from India. And that is emergence of this rights-based redistributive politics. I mean, very interestingly, from the mid-90s onwards, there have been a huge amount of movements. Now, some of them started as very small rights-based movement, like a Right to Food campaign, which started with a writ petition in Supreme Court in 2001 by PUCL Rajasthan. And then very soon they realized that if they have to, and the petition was that there was huge amount of unused food stocks rotting in the Food Corporation of India's godowns, use them to meet hunger of people. And they very soon realized that to implement that, they have to take care of employment, they have to take care of social security, pension, and therefore that Right to Food campaign has now evolved around issues of all of these. So there is a movement for pension, for making the public distribution system more accountable, and here Tamil Nadu is one of the examples where it works. So again, I mean, policies and implementation both can come together if there is a grassroots democratic mobilization, not only to implement existing policies, but also to bring new policies to the table. So this is kind of reinforcing what Amit said. I mean, there is no other alternative. That's what has to be done.
Let me just conclude with the 3 V's that Matt has in his PowerPoint, which are actually the 3 enabling conditions that the WeGo network that I coordinate believes in. The voice is they have to be organized. So the term MBOs is one that we've coined. We distinguish them from the technical NGOs because these are the democratic representative organizations of the workers. So the WeGo network is a technical NGO, but what is really needed is the MBO because all of us come and go, the workers stay, they hold the whole system accountable, hopefully. The visibility data is the critical ingredient. And data in the hands of the organizations then is power, right? And then for the sake of a 3rd V, we put validity, and that means that they're seen as economic agents. They're not seen as poor and vulnerable, only getting social services. They're seen as economic agents who contribute to the economy and are integrated into local economic planning. They're integrated into macroeconomic plans. They're taken seriously for their contributions and are seen as part of the solution, not the problem. One of the huge disadvantages of the working poor in the informal economy is they're tarred by the same brush as those who are genuinely illegal, underground criminal, black or gray. Whereas the bulk of the informal economy are working poor people. And one of our tasks is to destigmatize that legitimate part of the informal economy and say that it is the base of the workforce. I mean, these 2 came up with data on the manufacturing sector in India that I'm quoting here and there now a lot, which is that 75% of units and workers in modern manufacturing in modern India are informal. And of those, 75% are home-based, right? So if 75% of 75%, I think, means that 50% of manufacturing units in all of India are home-based, right? And if homes are evicted, homes don't get basic infrastructure services, they don't get electricity at fair prices, how can they be productive? The whole system is rigged, actually, in many ways, against this broad base of the economy, especially as you can see in South Asia. So that's why we believe in but those are only the enabling conditions. Then you have to change the mindset of people about the informal economy, and then you have to transform, because as Amit said, a lot of these regulations are completely inappropriate, completely non-existent, right, for these workers. So it's a huge, it's a way of thinking about the development challenge, if you will. And I just wanted to conclude that one thing we're going to do with the South Asia initiative at Harvard, but do it out in India to begin with, and then other countries, is Tarun and I had a discussion, and I say, you teach business at the Harvard Business School, but we don't even know what businesses in India actually look like, right? And what we would like to do is for each branch of industry, do what you did for manufacturing, right? Which is to look at the size distribution, the place of work, the ownership of businesses. So we really have I believe in the descriptive picture. It's not a very popular thing in economics, but let's just look at what the whole thing looks like. And then we can begin to talk about regulations and laws and reform. And then we will also in the conference also look at some of the issue of what regulations are driving what and all of that. But we're hoping to do that maybe by mid-2015. The next economic census data, I understand, comes out in December 2014. That's what Anand told me. Yeah, it would be out by then. So it would give people some time to analyze the data. If we need a bit longer, we can also discuss. So I'm hoping I can involve Deepankar and Amit and others of you that are interested. We would love to involve you, but we really think it's important, and we will move to other countries. I mean, we're beginning to do work on estimations of home-based workers and domestic workers in South Asia. We've done 4 countries home-based workers, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and India. And we'll try to do some of these other categories. So we really know what's going on in these economies and what the constraints are. So thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. And thanks to the South Asia Initiative and Nora and Meena and Tarun and others who are in the background making all this happen. So thank you. I think this is the last, this is the official closing of this year's annual symposium. Of this, okay.